Dedicated to my wife, Ralph Bunche. 1950, when in 46 years old, Dr. Ralph Bunche became the first black American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Named after Dr. Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded each year by the Norwegian Parliament and is the highest honor possible for one who has worked for international peace. Ralph Bunche won the prize for his work toward bringing about peace between Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East. This was not the first for Ralph Bunche, but it was the most special. It made Americans feel proud, but also a bit guilty. Ralph Bunche was being honored by the world when there were still places in his own country where he could not go because he was black. Ralph Bunche was born on August 7, 1904. Black people were not far removed from slavery. Only 40 years earlier, the Civil War had ended slavery, but whites had kept blacks from making much progress. There were segregated in housing, education, and jobs. They were discriminated against in restaurants and on public transportation. Most, especially in the South, were not allowed to vote. Conditions were only a little bit better in the North, where Ralph was born in Detroit, Michigan. His father, Fred, could not get to work in the city's factories because he was black. Instead, he earned a living as a baker. But Ralph's grandmother, Lucy Johnson, born a slave, believed that earning an honest living was the important thing. That and how a person felt about himself. The whole family lived together, Lucy Johnson and her 5 children. When her daughter, Olive Agnes, married Fred Bunche, there was no question that he would move in with his wife's family. Ralph remembers that the house was bubbling over with ideas and opinions, and that as far as back as he could remember, he was taught that education was the best way to get ahead in life. Work was also stressed, and from the time he was 7, Ralph was running errands for a neighborhood grocery store and selling newspapers. The neighborhood was mostly white. The Johnsons and Bunches were quite light-skinned and were thus more easily accepted than darker-skinned blacks might have been. Ralph's earlier friends were the children of German-speaking Austro-Hungarians who hated Italians far more than they did blacks. Ralph was about 10 when his mother was contracted rheumatic fever. Friends advised that the damp air of Detroit, which was surrounded by the Detroit's River, Lake St. Clair, and Lake Erie, was not good for Mrs. Bunche. She needed a warmer climate. The family talked about moving to a warmer, drier place and decided on Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ralph was 11 when the family moved to Albuquerque in 1915. New Mexico was a state that was only 3 years old, having joined the Union in 1912. There was a frontier atmosphere about the place and a strong Spanish influence because the area had once been part of Mexico. Ralph's family moved into an adobe house in a neighborhood that was mostly black, with a number of Mexican and Indian families. Ralph did not realize at the time that Albuquerque was a segregated city. One day he and his mother, who felt much better in a new climate, went to a movie downtown. As they entered the theater, an usher approached them and insisted that they sit in the balcony. Ralph was astonished. He wondered what his mother was going to do. Mrs. Bunche would not be told where to sit. She marched straight down the aisle to the center of the theater. Ralph was proud to follow her and proud of her. When Ralph entered 6th grade in the 4th Ward Elementary School, he found that he was one of only 2 blacks in his class of 65 students. He wasn't so sure he was going to like the school until he got to know his teacher, Miss Emma Sweet. Miss Sweet loved to teach, and her students responded by wanting to learn. Ralph made excellent grades and earned the respect of his fellow students. He soon decided that he wanted to become a teacher, like Miss Sweet. That same year, Ralph's little sister, Grace, was born. Now there was another mouth to feed in the Johnson Bunche household, and the family was having trouble making ends meet. To help out at home, Ralph got a job in a bakery nearby. Every day after school, he would eat a quick supper and then work in the hot kitchen of the bakery until it was hard to keep up with the schoolwork when he was so tired during the day, but he never complained. he wished he could do more for his mother. In spite of the healthier climate, Olive Bunche's health was getting worse. She died when Ralph was 13. Adding to this tragedy, his father died too of another illness. Ralph and his little sister Grace were orphans. Fortunately, they still had their grandmother, Lucy Johnson, whom everyone called Nana. She decided it was time to move to a new place, to make a new start. She had heard that there was an opportunity in California, and she soon moved the whole family to Los Angeles. In the California city, Ralph learned more about racial prejudice. His uncle Ralph had rented a small house in a predominantly white neighborhood, but when the family arrived to move in, they found the door locked. The landlord saw them coming and realized they were black. Nana, who would not bow to racism. They had paid 1 month's rent, and she ordered her nephew to break down the door. But when the month was over, they moved to a house in another mostly white neighborhood. They met with some hostility there too, but they stayed. Ralph enrolled at 30th Street Intermediate School and soon decided he didn't like it. Instead of being offered courses that could prepare him for college, he was placed in classes where practical, commercial subjects were taught. When Nana found out, she went to the principal and insisted that Ralph be switched to an academic course. He was able to take algebra and geometry, natural science, history, and French, and he began to like school again. After school, he peddled papers for the Los Angeles Times. During summer vacations, he worked as a house servant in Hollywood homes or in the kitchens of beach hotels. The summer he was 14, the Times sponsored an outing for all the newsboys at a pool in nearby Venice, California. When the boys made for the pool, Ralph and Charlie Matthews, the only two blacks, were stopped at the gate. No Negroes were allowed. Ralph and Charlie sat on a bench and watched the other boys having fun in the pool. They were so embarrassed that they tried to shrink down on the bench so they wouldn't be noticed. Ralph entered Jefferson High School. While the school was predominantly white, most of Ralph's friends were black. He hung around with a group of 15 and 20 other students. One of their favorite activities was integrating local soda parlors. They would enter one of the parlors and sit at the corner counter until they were served. Sometimes that took all day, but they usually won. In spite of having to work, Ralph made excellent grades in high school, and in his senior year he was expected to be named to the citywide Scholarship Honor Society. So did the rest of his class, since he had the highest grades, but when the list was read, Ralph's name was not on it. This was a form of racism he could not understand. Most of the discrimination he had suffered before had been impersonal, because he was black. But this case involved prejudice against him. Everyone in school knew him and knew his academic record. He was so angry that he wanted to leave school, but he realized that he would only be hurting his chances to go to college. At the end of the year, Ralph was named valedictorian of his class because he had the highest grades. But he was surprised to learn that he had also been chosen as commencement speaker. He just shook his head, wondering if he would ever understand white people. Ralph's fine academic record earned him a scholarship to the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. At first he wasn't sure if he should go to college. Very few of his classmates were going, and he wondered if he could measure up. Also, he knew his family could use the money he was making from working. He considered remaining at his summer jobs, laying carpets by day and doing janitorial work at night. But his grandmother would not hear of his working. "My grandmother is going to college. My grandson is going to college," he said. The scholarship paid for tuition and books, but Ralph had to work for room and board and other expenses. He found a basement room near the university that he could have rent-free in exchange for doing odd jobs around the building. With another student, he started a cleaning service, which gave him money for food and other expenses. In spite of working 2 jobs, he still managed to make good grades, which made him eligible to participate in sports at the university. He played football, basketball, and baseball during his freshman year. From time to time, Ralph encountered racism at UCLA. On one occasion, he was barred from the University Debating Society because he was black. Several members of the society objected, and when they could not make the society admit Ralph, they quit and formed their own debating society. They elected Ralph president. In his senior year, Ralph was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, the National Honor Society. He graduated from UCLA magna cum laude with high honors. He also received a fellowship for graduate work at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The fellowship covered only tuition, and Ralph wondered how he was going to pay for his other expenses, including his trip from California to Massachusetts. But by his time, he was something of a hero in the black community in Los Angeles. A local social club held a benefit for him and presented him with $1,000. Ralph had never been so far from home, but he was determined to do well at Harvard. He was one of the few black students there and was treated with great consideration. In fact, before he had succeeded in spite of his color, now he was being helped because of his color. But going to school at Harvard was no free ride. He worked at a bookstore near the university to earn money for his expenses and spent long hours studying for his courses in government. In 1928, when he was 24, he earned his master's degree in government and a fellowship for further study. He had started taking courses toward his doctoral degree when his beloved Nana died. He was deeply saddened to lose her, but he was happy she had lived long enough to see him get the education of which she had dreamed. Before continuing with his work toward his Ph.D., Bunche accepted an offer from Howard University to organize a new political science department. He was excited by the idea. Besides, he felt he needed a break from studying, and he could use the money. Howard was an old and respected black institution of higher learning, but it didn't have much money. That is why a young, inexperienced man like Bunche was also asked to start a whole new department. Also, there were very few blacks in the country who had managed to earn a master's degree in government. Some older professors at Howard wondered if Bunche was up to the job. They soon learned that he was. During his first year at Howard, Bunche met Ruth Harris, a native of Montgomery, Alabama, who was teaching elementary school in Washington, D.C., and taking graduate courses at Howard. Bunche had much time for romance, but when he found the right woman, it did not take him long to marry her. Ruth Harris became Mrs. Ralph Bunche the following June. Washington, D.C. was a very southern, segregated city in 1929 when Bunche arrived. The conditions in which most of its black citizens lived were terrible. Soon they were even worse. The stock market crashed in the fall of 1929, and the Great Depression that followed was much harder on blacks than on whites. Many lost their jobs, but what bothered Bunche most was the segregation which existed in good economic times and bad. He did not like the idea that in the capital of the United States, blacks were denied service in restaurants, made to sit in separate sections of theaters and streetcars, and not allowed to use public libraries and parks. He served on committees protesting discrimination by department stores and theaters. He also joined the local branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which worked against segregation. Meanwhile, he took courses at Harvard during the summer, and in 1932 went abroad for several months of study on a grant from the Rosenwald Fund. In 1934, at the age of 30, Ralph Bunche received his Ph.D. in Government and International Relations from Harvard. He was the first black man in the country to receive a Ph.D. in political science. He went to Howard to teach for 2 more years, but he wanted to do more study abroad. By this time, he and Ruth Bunche had 2 daughters, Joanne and Jane, and he knew that he should earn a steady salary and staying home with his family. But he was eager to learn more about the world, and his wife understood his need to know. And in 1936, this same year, he published his first book, Worldview of Race. Bunche took a leave of absence from Howard and set off for London and South Africa. His expenses were paid for by 2-year grant from the Social Research Council. His experience in South Africa was both painful and joyous. He was deeply angered by the way blacks were treated by the white South Africans who were in power. Segregation there was far worse than it was in the United States, but he was also delighted at the warmth of his reception from the African villages he visited. When he returned to the United States in 1938, Bunche began to work with Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal. Myrdal was doing a survey on the Negro in America, and Bunche took the opportunity to learn more about his own people in his own country. The two traveled throughout the South, interviewing people, black and white. They found a huge gulf between the races and so much discrimination against blacks that it was hard to imagine America ever being anything but a divided country. Bunche returned to Howard University in September 1941, but when he was offered a job with the United States Coordinator of Information, he took it. Shortly after he started that job, Japan bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the United States entered World War II. Most of Bunche's work had to do with preparations for the invasion of North Africa. In June 1942, he became chief of the African section. 2 years later, Bunche transferred to the State Department, where he was the first black ever to hold a desk job. The State Department was working on U.S. plans for a new world organization called the United States. They needed someone who knew about colonies and other dependent territories. Bunche did much to bring about the birth of the United Nations. There were many problems in setting up this attempt at a world government. Many countries, large and small, were suspicious of sharing power. Meanwhile, the Bunches had a third child, a son whom they named Ralph Jr. They tried to live as best they could in Washington, D.C., but segregation remained an ever-present fact of life. Their daughters had to be bused to a black school 3 miles from home because they were not allowed to attend the all-white grade school near where they lived. As a member of the State Department, as one of the organizers of the United Nations, Bunche could have used his position to speak out against segregation. He chose instead to concentrate on questions of peace and justice in the larger world. World War II ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific, but there was still much unrest in the world, and there were many changes in the nations of the world as a result of the war. In the early months of 1946, the Bunches moved to New York City, where Bunche went to work for the United Nations as director of the Trusteeship Division. In June 1947, Bunche visited Palestine with a United Nations Special Committee that later recommended that the area be partitioned. Since 1923, Palestine had been under the control of the British, but they were willing to turn it over to the United Nations. Under the partition agreement, 1/3 of the area would become the new state of Israel. 1/3 would be an Arab state, and 1/3, including the holy city of Jerusalem, would be an international zone. The neighboring Arab countries vowed to fight to prevent partition and attack the Israelis. The United Nations now faced the challenge of solving the Palestine problem. The major powers were not willing to use force to end the fighting that had broken out. The General Assembly of the United Nations, appointed by a mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte, a member of the Swedish royal family, Bunche, as director of the Trusteeship Division, headed the United Nations staff serving under Count Bernadotte. Count Bernadotte managed to negotiate a temporary truce, but on September 7, 1948, near Jerusalem, he was assassinated. The fragile truce soon ended. The Secretary General of the United Nations appointed Bunche as acting mediator, and he worked hard to bring about another truce. He told reporters that he intended to get a negotiated treaty signed. He vowed, "I'll never adjourn this meeting. I'll stay for 10 years if necessary." Many issues were at stake. There were issues of religion and race, but not to mention national pride, to get past before there could be a talk of peace. At first, Bunche met with each side separately. Then he started having meetings between the Israeli delegation and one Arab delegation at a time. When he wasn't conducting these meetings, he was preparing for them, working long hours and far into the night. He also had to contend with charges that he favored one side over the other. but all sides realized that he had experienced racism and discrimination himself and had a better understanding of the problems in the Middle East than many white Americans would have had. It took 81 days for Bunche to get the 4 armistice treaties necessary to end the fighting, but he succeeded and praise poured in from all over the world. Asked by reporters to speak on his role in bringing about a truce in Palestine, he referred to the charges that had been made about his being biased in favor of one side or the other. He said, I do indeed have a number of strong biases. I have a deep-seated bias against hate and intolerance. I have a bias against racial and religious bigotry. I have a bias against war, a bias for peace. Bunche took the occasion to talk about the racial problems in the United States, saying, I cannot avoid reminding my fellow Americans that all of us who have a sense of justice and fair play must contribute to the solution of a problem on our doorstep, which is perhaps more complex and baffling than Palestine problem, if our own great country is to be enabled fully to live up to the principles of the Charter to which all the United Nations are solemnly pledged. For his work in bringing about a truce to Palestine, Ralph Bunche was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. It was the greatest of many honors he received after he returned home. Bunche continued to work for the UN. In 1955, he was named Under-Secretary of the United Nations. He worked hard to maintain the fragile peace in the Middle East, which kept being threatened by one side or the other. He worked to guide former African colonies to independence. Meanwhile, in the United States, the nonviolent civil rights movement began and made great progress under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. Bunche supported the movement and walked beside Dr. King during the Selma to Montgomery March in Alabama in 1965, a march to demand voting rights for blacks in that state. Bunche devoted the rest of his life to his work for international peace. When he retired from the UN in June 1971 at the age of 67, it was because he was in very poor health. He died 6 months later on December 9th. In his own country, Ralph Bunche was never as famous as Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. He never wanted fame and to the end refused to write his own life story. Noting that Bunche was not the typical American hero, the magazine Progressive stated, when such men as Dr. Bunche also become great heroes in the eyes of millions of Americans, we will be approaching maturity as a nation. Until the world's peacemakers become our heroes too, we will not have achieved that maturity. The end.